Imagine staring across a vast, indifferent ocean with no land in sight. Your only companion is a hollowed log, bobbing beneath your fingertips as waves smack against its side. Each sway feels like a gamble with fate. One wrong move, and the sea claims you forever. This isn't a story of conquistadors or steamships, it's a tale of courage, carved into prehistoric wood. Tens of thousands of years ago, our ancestors made crossings with the simplest of tools. No steam, no sail, and no compass. Today, we're hunting for the signs of humans traversing high seas, from the world's oldest dugout canoe found in a Dutch peat bog, to mysterious cave paintings left on islands many kilometers offshore. Along the way, we'll look at artifacts and other things that don't necessarily give us direct evidence of open ocean navigation, but that can only be explained if people were capable enough to do so. By the end of this voyage, you'll see why seafaring wasn't just travel. It was a revolutionary cognitive leap that connected continents and transformed our species. So let's set sail into the deep history of human navigation and discover how the world's first sailors challenged the unknown and won. This is the oldest evidence of seafaring technology. Archaeologically, there are two ways we can look for evidence of water travel in the past. The first and more obvious one is to look for hard physical evidence of boats or other technologies that were used. Second is to look for evidence of people in other forms, like through other artifacts, footprints, or human remains, in places that would have been highly improbable to get to without water travel. This is inferred evidence, not necessarily direct. Both are valid, but the second one is slightly more speculative and a little more challenging to prove. So for now, let's tackle the hard evidence and then move on to the more mysterious stuff after. A real problem with this sort of archaeology is that wood is exceptionally prone to decay once submerged, because underwater environments can vary wildly in oxygen levels, microbial activity, and chemical composition. In oxygen-rich waters, wood quickly succumbs to fungi, bacteria, and shipworms, which chew through cell walls and leave only fragile fragments. Even in low oxygen muds, where wood can be astonishingly well preserved, fluctuations in water chemistry, salinity, or temperature can trigger rapid deterioration. When such timbers are exposed during excavation, the sudden influx of oxygen and drying causes shrinkage, cracking, and warping, unless they're immediately consolidated with very specific treatments. Moreover, abrasive currents and shifting sediments can physically abrade buried wood, eroding vital surface details before archaeologists can record them. These caveats mean that the archaeological record will probably remain significantly incomplete forever. So many sites have been lost to time that our sample size is inherently limited. That said, we have stumbled across some sites where the environment has remained just right in that Goldilocks zone of preservation, and many of those sites are in Europe. Europe has a long history of maritime adventures, and some of the oldest maritime technologies have been found here. This is especially true for North-Central Europe and Scandinavia. The Vikings were actually a more recent seafaring culture. Here, boats and canoe paddles appear to be prevalent. By the late Mesolithic, around 4700 BC, coastal and lake environments in what is now Denmark teemed with watercraft, powered not by sails or oars, but by hand-hewn paddles. These simple tools offer a direct window into early boat propulsion, woodworking skill, and the lifeways of hunter-gatherers adapting to watery landscapes. Take the Duvency Moor paddle, for example. Discovered in 1926 during peat bog excavations west of the German village of Duvency, this paddle is one of the earliest and most complete late Mesolithic paddles recovered from Northern Europe. Cut from a single piece of wood, likely ash or oak, it features a slender shaft widening into a rounded blade, roughly 30 centimeters long. Radiocarbon dating situates this paddle in the final centuries before 4000 BC, confirming its use by Ertebula hunter-gatherers, who depended heavily on inshore fishing and waterfowl hunting. Similar discoveries have been made off the coast of Denmark, where erosion has revealed submerged Mesolithic settlement layers. In 2008, a joint team from universities and museums excavated 3 ashwood paddles at this site. Each paddle measures approximately 1 meter in length, with gently wasted shafts and broadly spatulate blades. Charred fragments of other tools and hazelnut shells confirm these were crafted and used between 4700 BC and 4540 BC. Their preservation in this waterlogged soil underscores how shorelines can freeze-frame technology in remarkable detail at times. At the submerged settlement of Tybrandvig, now some 3 kilometers offshore on the Danish island of Funen, archaeologists have recovered more paddles, but this time ornamented with incised motifs, zigzags, concentric circles, and even stylized heart shapes. These decorations, carved just before 4000 BC, suggest that paddles held more than a utilitarian role. They were also canvases for social identity or maybe even ritual symbolism, hinting at a fusion of form and function among these artisans. Shaping a paddle required selecting straight, relatively knot-free timber, seasoning or green-working the wood to prevent cracking, and meticulously carving with flint or bone adzes. The uniformity of blade angles across sites implies shared ergonomic knowledge, perhaps passed down through apprenticeship or communal workshops. Moreover, paddles had to balance blade area with shaft length to maximize propulsion without excessive fatigue. This indicates a practical understanding of hydrodynamics. These Mesolithic paddles belie any notion that early watercraft were mere rafts, at least at this time. They were precision tools for dugout canoes or other vessels that could navigate rivers, estuaries, and coastal waters. By mastering paddle design, these people expanded their fishing range, established seasonal camps, and maintained far-flung social networks via waterborne routes. In this way, a carved wooden blade became an instrument of survival and a symbol of human ingenuity on the eve of the Neolithic. But we can go back even further, traveling this time to Africa. The Dafuna canoe was uncovered in 1987 on the banks of a river near the village of Dafuna in Nigeria. This region lies at the southern edge of the Sahara, today a semi-arid zone, but during the mid-Holocene, it formed part of the Green Sahara, characterized by lakes, marshes, and seasonal rivers. The canoe was found buried more than a meter deep in alluvial deposits, indicating that this area once hosted extensive waterways and supported rich aquatic ecosystems. Radiocarbon dates obtained from charcoal associated with the canoe's burial layer place its construction at roughly 6450 BC, around 8400 years ago, making it the oldest known boat in Africa and one of the world's earliest dugout canoes. Carved from a single Ophizelia africana log, the hull measures about 8.4 meters long and dimensions well suited for navigating shallow, meandering rivers. Analysis of tool marks shows that the hunters and fishers who crafted it used adzes and gouges fashioned from stone to hollow out the trunk, demonstrating a high degree of woodworking skill and an intimate knowledge of local timber resources. Beyond its impressive age, the Dafuna canoe illuminates the adaptive strategies of early riverine communities in West Africa. Its existence confirms that by the mid-Holocene, people were already exploiting boats, not just for fishing, but for seasonal mobility, exchange, and perhaps even wider social networking along waterways. In an environment where terrestrial routes could be treacherous during the wet season, a reliable dugout canoe offered access to fish-rich lagoons, facilitated trade in salt or pottery, and allowed groups to track game migrations along river corridors. As such, the Dafuna canoe shows us how water-savvy ancient Africans were. The last example we'll look at is the current oldest artifactual evidence of a water vessel. The Pest canoe, unearthed in the peat bogs of northeastern Netherlands, represents the earliest known watercraft in the world. Discovered accidentally during road construction in 1955 near the village of Pest, this slender dugout was recovered from waterlogged deposits roughly 1.5 meters below the surface. Today, that location sits amid drained farmland, But around 9500 BC, the area formed part of a dynamic wetland system of lakes, channels, and marshes left behind by retreating Ice Age glaciers. Radiocarbon studies on wood samples from the canoe's bow and stern have consistently returned dates centered around 8200 and 7600 BC, placing the vessel firmly in the early Mesolithic. The canoe is hewn from a single Scots pine trunk, its interior hollowed with stone adzes to create a narrow, symmetric hull, approximately 2.5 meters long. The tool mark patterns include parallel chisel grooves and pecking traces, which reveal a labor-intensive process, requiring careful selection of straight-grained timber, systematic splitting, and controlled removal of material, all to maintain even hull thickness. Despite its age, the functionality of this 10,000-year-old canoe has been experimentally verified. Dutch experimental archaeologists commissioned a full-scale replica, following published plans of the original's dimensions. Using flint-tipped antler adzes, this team carved a new dugout that successfully supported a paddler on a calm canal, demonstrating that even this early form of boat could carry people and light loads. This hands-on reconstruction dispelled early suggestions that the original might have been a stationary trough or trough-like container. The ergonomics, buoyancy, and balance all point to deliberate signs of a watercraft. Archaeologically, the Pest canoe illuminates the lifeways of hunter-gatherer groups who thrived in a shifting post-glacial environment. Mesolithic foragers exploited the burgeoning wetlands for fish, waterfowl, and aquatic plants, resources that would have been difficult to access without boats. The canoe would have enabled seasonal circuit travel between flooded marshes in the spring, fish-rich lakes in the summer, and reed harvest areas in autumn. Beyond subsistence, the Pest canoe points to broader cognitive and social developments, like these other technologies did. Carving a proper vessel like this presupposes advanced spatial reasoning, envisioning the boat's internal volume, predicting its buoyancy, and understanding how shape influences stability. The investment of time and community labor into constructing such a tool implies planning, knowledge transmission, and perhaps rituals. In effect, the canoe is a technological milestone for humanity. These artifacts remind us how fragile early wooden artifacts are, and how chance plays into what survives. Had post-glacial sea levels risen more abruptly, or the peat been drained earlier, these canoes and paddles might have decayed without a trace. Instead, the timber has been preserved and offers us a frozen moment of the ingenuity at the dawn of Europe's Mesolithic. These people were not bound to land, but were already mastering the element that would eventually connect continents. All of these examples go far back into prehistory, but none of them indicate a watercraft of the size or complexity we would think is necessary for traversing big seas. Yet, other forms of evidence tell us that people predating these likely did make such expeditions. But hey, before exploring those examples, if you missed my last video where I talked about my new second channel, I want to briefly fill you in. It's a little more fun, not research focused, and I'll be using it to explore and make music themed around the human experience. Picture long ambient songs intended to drop you into specific cultures, time periods, or even the future of humanity. I've just started it and just started releasing videos. So if you're looking for something to fall asleep to or study to, the link to that will be in the description. So go hit that subscribe button. When boats haven't survived, and they've long since vanished beneath layers of sediment or eroded away, it's time to look at the indirect evidence. Tools, footprints, fingerprints, and exotic cargoes, all of which whispering of oceanic ventures. In the absence of surviving watercraft, archaeologists turn to the principle of no land bridge, no passage. If people, plants, or artifacts appear on islands that were never connected to the mainland, or only connected after their presence, the only plausible explanation is that they crossed the water by some sort of boat or raft. These clues, though subtle, form a compelling case for seafaring technology, revealing how our forerunners dared to master open sea voyages. In this next section, we'll survey the most striking cases of inferred seafaring. Each is a testament to early navigational skill, from small-bodied hominins in Southeast Asia to hand axe wielders on the island of Crete. And from cave art in Sulawesi's limestone caves to the deep water fishhooks of East Timor, these lines of evidence push back the frontier of maritime history. As we piece together each fragment, you'll see not only the wide geographic reach of ancient sailors, but also the cognitive leaps they must have made when shaping logs, reading coastlines, and plotting courses across open water. Just to give you guys a heads up, I kind of came down with a little cold halfway through recording this video, so from here on out, my voice might sound a little stuffed up. Sorry about that, but the show must go on, so let's continue. Nestled in the sun-baked coast of East Timor, Jaramalai and its nearby outcrops offer some of the most compelling indirect evidence for early sea voyages by past humans. This rugged promontory, buffeted by Indian Ocean swells and hemmed in by steep limestone cliffs, was once a lifeline for Pleistocene coastal foragers. Today, its caves and rock shelters are time capsules, richly imbued with marine artifacts, none more revealing than intricately carved shell fishhooks and the remains of deep water species that together paint a vivid picture of seafaring mastery. Around 42,000 years ago, sea levels in Wallacea, the region between Southeast Asia and Australia, were tens of meters lower than today. Yet, kilometers of open water still separated Timor from mainland Southeast Asia. The coastline of Jaramalai would have featured a series of bays and reefs, ideal for wave-pounded fishing, but treacherous for unskilled swimmers. Fresh water was seasonally scarce, and subsistence depended on both terrestrial game and marine resources. Here, specialized maritime equipment was not a luxury, but a necessity for survival. Excavations, led by archaeologist Sue O'Connor, uncovered meticulously crafted fishhooks, made from trochus shells. The hooks exhibit polishing and features requiring fine motor skill, abrasion techniques, and a clear conceptual leap from simple sharpened stones to purpose-built fishing gear. They date to around 20,000 years ago, making them the oldest evidence of Paleolithic offshore fishing. Even more striking are the faunal remains, bones of large pelagic fish such as tuna, trevally, and mackerel, which cannot be captured from shore. Essentially, these species were found at the site, but they typically inhabit deeper water beyond the reef break. All of this implies that Jaramalai's occupants set out on watercraft sturdy enough to navigate swell zones and carry sufficient provisions for multi-hour excursions. And these faunal remains actually predate the fishhooks to around 42,000 years ago. The co-occurrence of sophisticated shell hooks and deep water fish supports the view that Jaramalai's inhabitants had to have possessed some sort of small dugout canoes or plank and lashing vessels. Also, seafaring at Jaramalai was more than a technical feat. Planning marine expeditions required anticipating weather patterns, understanding lunar and tidal cycles, and coordinating group efforts, from boat building through provisioning to route finding. Moreover, the creation and maintenance of fishing gear like shell hooks imply knowledge transmission across generations, apprenticeship structures, and perhaps even ritualized initiation into seafaring roles. This behavioral complexity likely catalyzed wider social networks, as coastal foragers exchanged goods and information with inland communities. Outside of Timor, the wider Wallacea region contains some of the most significant indirect evidence of seafaring technology. Our next clue lies farther north, in Sulawesi, Indonesia, where a series of paintings on various cave walls speak volumes about the first mariners. The limestone karsts of Sulawesi's Maros Pangkep region preserve some of the oldest known figurative cave art on the planet, paintings that can only exist if modern humans were crossing open sea by at least 51,200 years ago. At Liang Karampuang, researchers dated a complex panel depicting three human-like figures interacting with a warty pig to a minimum of 51.2 thousand years ago, which was based on the uranium series ages of minerals overlying the pigment. This quote-unquote picture story is not only the earliest narrative composition known, but also compelling indirect evidence that its creators arrived by boat to a landmass never connected to Asia by dry land. A few kilometers away, the Liang Tadongi cave preserves a life-size red pigmented representation of a Sulawesi warty pig, intertwined with hand stencils and abstract motifs. More uranium series dating of calcite layers that form atop the image yielded a minimum age of 45.5 thousand years ago, making it another early example of figurative animal art anywhere in the world. The precision of the pigment application and the large scale of the pig figure suggests not just spontaneous graffiti, but a planned, culturally significant act, one that required a settled group capable of maritime travel, logistical provisioning, and the social cohesion to return repeatedly to a limestone outcrop by the sea. Further evidence of artistic continuity appears in Liang Bulu Sepang 4, where a 4.5-meter long hunting depiction shows a group of small therianthropic figures wielding ropes or spears against a dwarf buffalo. This image was similarly placed around the same time period, roughly 43,000 years ago, demonstrating that the residents of this site maintained a symbolic tradition spanning at least several millennia. With multiple characters, actors, and prey, this painting may be the oldest hunting scene ever represented in art form. Geographically, Sulawesi is a large island, and its western peninsula has been isolated by deep straits, more than 70 kilometers wide, even during glacial low stands. Its isolation is a direct consequence of deep water seaways. In fact, the last time Sulawesi was ever connected to any mainland was during the Eocene, around 45 million years ago, well before human existence. Therefore, it has never been joined to the Asian mainland during the time frame of human evolution, making any human presence on its shores impossible without seafaring technology. The repeated dating of figurative art across at least 3 caves, each exceeding 40,000 years ago, argues against a one-off colonization. Instead, it suggests possibly established maritime routes and sustained occupations by groups with the cognitive aptitude for map-like mental representations. Our last example of Homo sapiens bouncing around this part of the world takes us to the land down under. I made an entire video on the prehistoric colonization of Australia, and to my surprise, it became my most debated video. Just take a look at the comments. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to check that out, but it's worth revisiting in this video. Quite a few sites in Australia, especially to the north, fall into that 30 to 45,000 year old range, which aligns nicely to what we saw in Timor and Sulawesi. The presence of sites gets fewer and further between as we go back in time, until we finally hit the oldest and most controversial site in Australia, Maja Baby. Overlooking the floodplains of Arnhem Land in Australia's tropical north, Maja Baby is a shallow rock shelter that preserves the continent's deepest time capsule of human activity. Optically stimulated luminescence dates place its earliest stone tools, ground stone axes, ochre fragments, and hearths, to around 65,000 years ago, at least 15 millennia before similar sites elsewhere in the area. Overlying soil layers record continuous use into the Holocene. Because Australia was never connected to Asia by land, even at peak glacial lows, Maja Baby's occupants must have arrived via deliberate open sea voyages through Wallaceia's deep water straits. However, the age of this site remains contested. Critics argue that bioturbation, in the form of termite activity, may have disturbed the soil layers, calling the 65,000-year-old date into question. Defenders of the early date point to careful micromorphology, or soil analyses, the integrity of stratified hearth features, and concordant radiocarbon ages above and below the key cultural horizons. Regardless of the precise chronology debate, no alternative explanation exists for human occupation in northern Australia even 50,000 years ago, except intentional sea crossings. At the lowest glacial sea levels, the Sahul Shelf, which is part of the continental shelf of Australia, did expose continuous land linking mainland Australia with Papua New Guinea across the Torres Strait, but never connected Australia to Eurasia. Between Southeast Asia and Sahul lies the waters of the Wallacea, which remained hundreds of meters deep throughout the Pleistocene, precluding any dry land corridor. To reach Maja Baby in Arnhem Land, Pleistocene foragers had to navigate at least one major open sea crossing of about 100 kilometers, plus several shorter passages, hopping from island to island. While debate continues over whether Maja Baby truly dates to 65,000 years ago, its assemblage undeniably testifies to human adaptation to Sahul by at least 50,000 years ago, making Maja Baby a masterpiece of research into Sahul's colonization story and the earliest maritime ingenuity of our species. But one thing about our species is that we are only just recently the sole hominin on the planet. there were once many more human variants, and given their likely cognitive similarities to us, they too might have made journeys across vast expanses of water. So let's see if there is any validity to this in the archaeological record. The island of Crete was once the center of the Minoan civilization. Little did those Bronze Age people know, however, that they built their settlement atop much older Stone Age remains. Crete's Placius Peninsula has yielded large cutting tools like hand axes, cleavers, and massive scrapers eroding from uplifted marine terraces. Dating the soil layers above and below the artifacts has bracketed them to between 113,000 and 130,000 years ago. Because the island sits behind at least 40 kilometers of deep Mediterranean water and has been tectonically isolated since the Miocene, the only way Acheulean toolmakers could reach its shores was by the sea. The assemblage's technology, including bifacial reduction on local milky quartz, matches African Acheulean forms as old as 800,000 years ago, which hints that the visitors may have been late Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis rather than modern humans. Others have argued that it was Neanderthals who made this journey. Regardless of the specific species, researchers claim that hominins may have arrived on Crete in the Middle Pleistocene as part of this hominin dispersal, and that open water crossing, at least in the southern Aegean, may have been involved. This chronology pushes systematic Mediterranean voyaging back at least 100,000 years earlier than previously thought, long before Neolithic farmers ever occupied the island. Skeptics, however, note the small sample and suggest wave action could have rafted hominins unintentionally. Whether accidental or deliberate, the Placius hand axes stand as the clearest example that pre-sapiens hominins had already experienced the open seas. A hominin species that's gained a lot of attention recently is Homo floresiensis, partly because of its role in our story here. Though not conclusive, this species may hold our oldest evidence of sea travel. Flores, an island in Indonesia's Lesser Sunda chain, is a rugged landmass of approximately 14,250 square kilometers, characterized by volcanic peaks, dense forests, and a rich biodiversity that includes the famed Komodo dragon. Despite its proximity to other islands, Flores has remained geographically isolated, necessitating water travel for any species to reach it, like many of the sites already discussed. Unlike those other sites, however, its location has led to distinct evolutionary developments among its inhabitants, that being Homo floresiensis, a diminutive hominin species discovered in 2003 in Liang Bua Cave. It has been nicknamed the Hobbit for its small stature. Adults stood about 1 meter or 3 feet tall and weighed around 30 kilograms or 65 pounds. Their skeletal features, including a small brain size and large feet, suggest a unique evolutionary path, which is contrary to the trend of increased hominin brain growth at the time. Stone tools on the island have been dated to as far back as 1 million years ago, and the species is believed to have survived until as recently as possibly 12,000 years ago. The evolutionary origins of this species are debated. Some researchers propose they descended from Homo erectus populations that underwent island dwarfism due to limited resources, while others suggest a lineage from more primitive hominins, like Homo habilis or Australopithecus, based on certain anatomical features. Fossil discoveries at Matamang, dating to around 700,000 years ago, support the idea of long-term isolation and evolutionary adaptations specific to Flores' island environment. Island dwarfism, also known as insular dwarfism, is an evolutionary phenomenon where animal species evolve smaller bodies after becoming isolated on islands. This process occurs due to a combination of factors, typically found in these ecosystems, like limited food resources, reduced predation pressure, or competition within a smaller ecological niche. On resource-scarce islands, smaller bodies are more energy efficient and thus more likely to be favored by natural selection. Over many generations, this can lead to dramatic size reductions compared to mainland ancestors. In the case of Homo floresiensis, many scientists believe this is what happened to an ancestral population of Homo erectus, who became isolated on Flores and gradually adapted to its constrained environment. As fascinating as this long biological process is, can we say that their arrival was the product of seafaring technology? No. Sea travel, yes, but not necessarily an intentional voyage. A popular alternative hypothesis is that it was by accident, due to a natural disaster. They were possibly swept out to sea by a catastrophic tsunami, storm surge, or volcanic event. In this scenario, Small groups may have been clinging to vegetation mats or natural rafts of debris and were carried across ocean channels by currents or wind. Though accidental rafting is rare, similar events are known to have transported animals to remote lands throughout natural history. Some examples include green iguanas, which were observed traveling from Guadalupe to Anguilla in 1995 due to a hurricane. Another is South American monkeys, which are thought to have undergone the most extreme version of this, crossing the Atlantic Ocean from Africa around 35 million years ago. These natural colonization events lend credibility to the idea that ancient hominins, though not seafarers, could have arrived at remote islands like Flores through rare, catastrophic, but biologically plausible means. But I like to think that these little hobbits were smart enough to travel the seas, or their ancient Homo erectus ancestors. One place we barely discussed until now is the Americas, but there are some interesting implications for sea travel and South American genetics worth exploring. To dive into that topic, check out the video on the right. On the left is a link to my new music channel. Go give my stuff a listen and hit that subscribe button. Stay curious.